Hey, amazing viewers! Before we go into this riveting narrative, drop your location in the comments below. We love connecting with you all around the world. Also, if this is your first time here, press the subscribe button and join our incredible journey. Let's hit 10,000 subscribers this month together. Your support means everything. The innocence of childhood. The sun was setting over the small village, casting a golden hue over the mud brick houses and the narrow, winding paths that connected them. The air was thick with the scent of jasmine and the distant hum of cicadas. I was 8 years old, sitting on the cool, tiled floor of my aunt's house, surrounded by women whose laughter echoed off the walls. I didn't understand why they were laughing, or why they kept looking at me with those knowing smiles. All I knew was that I was the center of attention, and for a little girl who had spent most of her life in the shadows of her older siblings, that was something special. "Nyla, come here," my aunt called, her voice warm but commanding. I scrambled to my feet, my small hands brushing off the dust from my dress as I made my way over to her. She was sitting on a low stool, her hands busy with a pile of colorful fabrics. "Look at this," she said, holding up a piece of cloth that shimmered in the fading light. "This will be your wedding dress." I blinked at her, confused. "Wedding dress?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The word felt heavy on my tongue, foreign and unfamiliar. I had heard of weddings, of course. I had seen the brides in their beautiful dresses, their faces glowing with happiness as they danced with their new husbands. But those brides were grown-ups, not little girls like me. My aunt chuckled, her eyes crinkling at the corners. "Yes, your wedding dress. You're going to be a bride soon, Nyla. Isn't that exciting?" I didn't know what to say. Exciting? I wasn't sure. All I knew was that I was getting a lot of attention, and that felt nice. The women around me were cooing and fussing over me, pinching my cheeks and telling me how beautiful I was going to look. They gave me gifts, small trinkets and sweets, and I accepted them with a shy smile, not understanding the significance of what was happening. Later that evening, I was led into a room where a man was waiting. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with a serious expression on his face. I recognized him as my cousin, the son of my father's brother. He was much older than me, maybe 15 or 16, and I had only seen him a handful of times before. He didn't say much, just nodded at me as I entered the room. "This is your fiancé," my aunt said, her voice filled with pride. "You're going to be married to him." I looked up at him, my heart pounding in my chest. Married. To him. I didn't understand what that meant, but I could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on me. The women in the room were giggling and whispering, their eyes darting between me and my cousin. I felt a strange mix of emotions. Excitement, confusion, and a faint sense of unease that I couldn't quite place. "Smile, Nyla," my aunt urged, and I did, even though I didn't feel like it. Someone took a picture, and I remember looking at it later, seeing myself as a little girl with a forced smile on my face, standing next to a boy who was almost a man. I didn't know it then, but that picture would haunt me for years to come. The next few days were a blur of celebrations and rituals. There was music and dancing, and I was dressed in the beautiful clothes that the women had made for me. I was given more gifts, and everyone kept telling me how lucky I was. But as the days passed, I began to feel a growing sense of dread. I didn't understand what was happening, but I knew that something was changing, something that I couldn't control. When it was time to leave the village and return to America, I felt a strange sense of relief. I was going back to my normal life, back to school and my friends. But as I sat on the plane, staring out at the clouds, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been taken from me, something that I would never get back. I started 4th grade a few weeks later, and for a while, life seemed to return to normal. I made new friends, and I even developed a crush on a boy in my class. But whenever I thought about him, I would remember the boy in the picture, the one who was supposed to be my husband. I would tell myself that there was no hope, that I was already engaged, and that I couldn't let myself feel anything for anyone else. It wasn't until years later, when I was 14 and starting high school, that I realized the full extent of what had happened to me. My parents, worried that I was becoming too westernized, decided to bring my cousin to America. They applied for a visa, and when it was approved, they told me that he would be coming to live with us. That's when I realized that the engagement wasn't just a childhood memory. It was a reality that I would have to face. I was terrified. I didn't want to marry him, but I didn't know how to say no. My parents were strict, and I knew that they wouldn't listen to me. I tried to talk to them, to explain how I felt, but they just brushed me off, telling me that it was my duty to marry him, that it was what was expected of me. When my cousin arrived, I felt like my world was collapsing around me. He was older now, a man, and he expected me to act like his wife. I was still a child, but he didn't see me that way. He saw me as his property, something that he could control. I tried to resist, to stand up for myself, but it only made things worse. My parents beat me, and I was sent to live in foster care for a while. But even there, I couldn't escape the reality of my situation. I ran away from foster care, desperate to find some kind of freedom, but I was quickly lured back into the trap of child marriage. It wasn't until I was much older, after years of struggle and pain, that I finally found the strength to fight back. I reached out to lawmakers, to anyone who would listen, and I told them my story. I told them about the little girl who had been forced into a marriage she didn't understand, and about the woman who had survived, and was determined to make sure that no other girl would have to go through what I did. It wasn't easy, and there were times when I felt like giving up. But I kept going, because I knew that I had to. I had to fight for myself, and for all the other girls who were trapped in the same situation. And in the end, I won. Nyla's law was passed, and the age of marriage in New York was raised to 18. It was a small victory, but it was a start. Now, as I look back on my life, I see the pieces of myself that were broken and scattered along the way. But I also see the strength that I found within myself. The strength to keep going, to keep fighting, no matter how hard it got. And I know that if I can do it, so can anyone else. We just have to stay strong. This is the first part of the story, setting the stage for Nyla's journey from a child bride to a survivor and advocate. The narrative is designed to feel real and immersive, drawing the reader into Nyla's world and her experiences. The next part will delve deeper into her struggles and her fight for freedom. The weight of expectations. The sound of the school bell echoed through the halls of Baldwin High School, signaling the end of another day. I slung my backpack over my shoulder and made my way to the exit, my mind racing with thoughts of the homework I had to do and the upcoming math test I was dreading. But as I stepped out into the crisp autumn air, I was met with a sight that made my stomach churn. He was standing there, leaning against the chain-link fence, his eyes scanning the crowd of students as they poured out of the building. My cousin, no, my fiancé. He had been in America for a few weeks now, and every day he would come to pick me up from school, as if he had some kind of claim over me. I tried to avoid him, to slip out the back door or hide in the library, until he gave up and left, but he always seemed to find me. Nyla, he called, his voice cutting through the chatter of the other students. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I could feel the eyes of my classmates on me, their curious glances making my skin crawl. I wanted to run, to disappear, but I knew I couldn't. My parents had made it clear that I was to obey him, to treat him with the respect that a husband deserved. I forced a smile onto my face and walked over to him, my steps slow and deliberate. "Hi," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. He didn't say anything, just nodded and started walking towards the car. I followed him, my mind racing with thoughts of how I could escape this nightmare. But deep down, I knew there was no escape. My parents had made their decision, and there was nothing I could do to change it. The ride home was silent, the tension between us palpable. I stared out the window, watching the world go by, wishing I could be anywhere but here. When we finally pulled into the driveway, I was relieved to see that my parents weren't home yet. Maybe I could sneak upstairs and hide in my room until dinner. But as soon as we stepped inside, he turned to me, his eyes dark and intense. "We need to talk," he said, his voice low and serious. I felt a lump form in my throat, but I nodded and followed him into the living room. He sat down on the couch, and I perched on the edge of the armchair, my hands clenched tightly in my lap. "Your parents have been talking to me," he began, his eyes never leaving mine. "They're worried about you. They think you're becoming too American, too westernized. They want us to get married soon, before you lose your way completely." I felt like the walls were closing in around me, the air growing thick and heavy. "I'm only 14, I whispered, my voice trembling. "I'm not ready to get married." He leaned forward, his expression hardening. "You're never going to be ready, Nyla. But this is what's expected of you. This is your duty." I wanted to scream, to tell him that I didn't care about duty, that I just wanted to be a normal teenager. But I knew it wouldn't do any good. He wouldn't listen, and neither would my parents. I was trapped, with no way out. The days turned into weeks, and the pressure continued to mount. My parents started making plans for the wedding, discussing dates and venues as if it were the most natural thing in the world. They didn't seem to care that I was still a child, that I had dreams and aspirations that didn't involve being a wife. I tried to fight back, to stand up for myself, but every time I did, I was met with anger and violence. My parents would beat me, telling me that I was being disrespectful, that I was bringing shame to the family. My fiancé would watch, his expression cold and unfeeling, as if he enjoyed seeing me suffer. I felt like I was drowning, like the weight of their expectations was crushing me. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. All I could do was try to survive, to get through each day without breaking down. But then, something inside me snapped. I realized that I couldn't keep living like this, that I had to find a way out. I started researching my options, looking for any kind of help or support. I reached out to teachers, to counselors, to anyone who might be able to help me. One day, I found the courage to go to the police. I told them everything, about the engagement, about the abuse, about the fact that I was being forced into a marriage I didn't want. They listened, their expressions growing more and more serious as I spoke. "We'll look into this," one of the officers said, his voice filled with concern. "But you need to be careful. If your parents find out you've spoken to us, they could retaliate." I nodded, my heart pounding in my chest. I knew the risks, but I also knew that I couldn't keep living like this. I had to take a stand, no matter what the consequences. A few days later, I was removed from my home and placed in foster care. It was a strange and unsettling experience, being in a house full of strangers, but it was also a relief. For the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe, like I was free from the constant pressure and fear. But the freedom didn't last long. My parents fought to get me back, and eventually they succeeded. I was returned to their custody, and the abuse started all over again. But this time, I was determined not to let them break me. I had tasted freedom, and I knew that I would do whatever it took to get it back. I started reaching out to lawmakers, to activists, to anyone who would listen. I told them my story, and I begged them to help me. It wasn't easy, and there were times when I felt like giving up. But I kept going, because I knew that I had to. I had to fight for myself, and for all the other girls who were trapped in the same situation. And in the end, I won. Nyla's law was passed, and the age of marriage in New York was raised to 18. It was a small victory, but it was a start. And I knew that as long as I kept fighting, I could make a difference. This is the second part of the story, delving deeper into Nyla's struggles and her fight for freedom. The narrative continues to feel real and immersive, drawing the reader into Nyla's world and her experiences. The next part will explore her journey through foster care and her eventual escape from the child marriage trap. The fractured escape. The foster home was a small, weathered house on the edge of town, its paint peeling and its front yard overgrown with weeds. It didn't look like much, but to me, It was a sanctuary, a place where I could breathe, even if just for a little while. The social worker who dropped me off gave me a sympathetic smile and a pat on the shoulder before driving away, leaving me standing on the porch with a duffel bag of my belongings. I felt like a stranger in my own life, like I had been ripped out of one world and thrown into another. The foster parents, a middle-aged couple named Linda and Greg, were kind but distant. They had 2 other foster kids living with them, a boy named Marcus who was always glued to his video games, and a girl named Jasmine who barely spoke to anyone. The house was quiet, almost eerily so, and I spent most of my time in the small room they had given me, staring at the ceiling and trying to make sense of everything that had happened. For the first time in years, I wasn't being told what to do, how to act, or who to be. But instead of feeling free, I felt lost. The weight of my past clung to me like a shadow, and no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake it. I kept thinking about my parents, about the life I had left behind. I wondered if they missed me, if they regretted what they had done. But deep down, I knew the answer. To them, I was a disobedient daughter, a stain on their honor. They would never forgive me for running away. The days blurred together, each one feeling longer and more empty than the last. I tried to focus on school, on the small routines that gave my life some semblance of normalcy. But it was hard. Every time I walked into the classroom, I felt like everyone was staring at me, like they could see the scars I was trying so hard to hide. I kept my head down, my eyes fixed on my desk, and did my best to disappear. But then, one day, something changed. It was during English class, and we were reading a poem by Maya Angelou. The teacher, Mrs. Thompson, had a way of making the words come alive, of making you feel like they were written just for you. As she read the lines, "You may shoot me with your words, you may cut me with your eyes, you may kill me with your hatefulness, but still, like air, I'll rise," I felt something stir inside me. It was a feeling I hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. After class, I stayed behind, my heart pounding in my chest. "Mrs. Thompson," I said, my voice trembling, "can I talk to you?" She looked up from her desk, her eyes soft and understanding. "Of course, Nyla. What's on your mind?" I hesitated, unsure of where to begin. But then the words came pouring out, like a dam had broken inside me. I told her everything, about the engagement, the abuse, the foster care. I told her how I felt like I was drowning, like I didn't know who I was or where I belonged. And she listened, her expression never wavering, her eyes never leaving mine. When I was finished, she reached out and took my hand, her grip firm and reassuring. "Nyla," she said, her voice steady and strong, "you are so much stronger than you think. What you've been through, it's unimaginable. But you're still here. You're still fighting. And that's what matters." Her words stayed with me, like a lifeline I could hold on to when the world felt too heavy. I started to open up more, to let people in. I joined the school's debate team, where I found a group of kids who didn't care about my past, who only cared about what I could bring to the table. I started to feel like I had a place, like I belonged. But just as I was beginning to find my footing, my world was turned upside down again. My parents had been fighting to get me back, and after months of legal battles, they succeeded. The social worker came to pick me up one afternoon, her face filled with regret. "I'm so sorry, Nyla," she said, "but the court has ruled in their favor. You're going back home." I felt like the ground had been ripped out from under me. All the progress I had made, all the hope I had found, it was gone, just like that. I wanted to scream, to fight, to run away, and never look back. But I knew it wouldn't do any good. The system had failed me, just like it had failed so many other girls like me. When I got home, my parents were waiting for me, their expressions cold and unyielding. "You've caused us enough shame," my father said, his voice like a whip. "You will do as you're told, or there will be consequences." I nodded, my heart heavy with despair. But even as I walked back into the life I had tried so hard to escape, I knew that I couldn't give up. I had tasted freedom, and I knew that I would do whatever it took to get it back. Over the next few months, I started to plan my escape. I reached out to the few people I trusted: Mrs. Thompson, a counselor at school, a friend from the debate team. I told them what was happening, and they promised to help me. It wasn't easy, and there were times when I felt like I was risking everything. But I knew that I had to try. One night, when my parents were asleep, I packed a small bag with the essentials and slipped out the window. I didn't know where I was going or what I would do when I got there. All I knew was that I couldn't stay. I couldn't let them control me anymore. As I walked through the dark, empty streets, I felt a strange sense of peace. For the first time in my life, I was making my own choices, my own decisions. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew that I was finally free. This is the third part of the story, exploring Nyla's journey through foster care and her eventual escape from the child marriage trap. The narrative continues to feel real and immersive, drawing the reader into Nyla's world and her experiences. The next part will delve into her life on the run and her fight for justice. The long road to freedom. The night air was cold and biting as I walked down the empty streets, my breath visible in the dim glow of the streetlights. My backpack, stuffed with a few clothes, a notebook, and whatever money I had managed to save, felt heavy on my shoulders. Every sound, the rustle of leaves, the distant hum of a car engine, made my heart race. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see my parents or my fiancé chasing after me. But the streets were empty, and the only footsteps I heard were my own. I didn't have a plan, not really. All I knew was that I couldn't go back. I couldn't let them control me anymore. I had spent my entire life being told what to do, who to be. And now, for the first time, I was making my own choices. It was terrifying, but it was also exhilarating. I felt like a bird that had been caged for too long, finally spreading its wings and taking flight. I walked for hours, my feet aching and my mind racing. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew I had to keep moving. Eventually, I found myself at a 24-hour diner on the outskirts of town. The warm light spilling out from the windows felt like a beacon, and I hesitated for a moment before pushing the door open. The diner was nearly empty, save for a few truckers sitting at the counter and a tired-looking waitress wiping down tables. I slid into a booth in the corner, my hands trembling as I picked up the menu. I wasn't hungry, but I needed a place to sit, to think, to figure out what to do next. The waitress came over, her eyes narrowing as she took in my disheveled appearance. "You okay, honey?" she asked, her voice tinged with concern. I forced a smile and nodded. "Yeah, I'm fine. Just need a cup of coffee." She studied me for a moment, then nodded and walked away. I could feel her eyes on me as she poured the coffee, and I knew she didn't believe me. But she didn't press, and for that, I was grateful. As I sat there, sipping the bitter coffee and staring out the window, I started to think about my next steps. I couldn't stay in this town. It was too small, too close to my parents. I needed to get as far away as possible, somewhere they wouldn't think to look for me. But I didn't have much money, and I didn't know anyone who could help me. Then I remembered Mrs. Thompson, my English teacher. She had been the one person who had truly listened to me, who had made me feel like I wasn't alone. I didn't know if she would help me, but I had to try. I pulled out my notebook and scribbled down her address, my hands shaking as I wrote. It was a long shot, but it was the only shot I had. I paid for the coffee with the last of my cash and stepped back out into the cold night. The walk to Mrs. Thompson's house was long and grueling, but I didn't have any other options. I kept my head down, my hood pulled low over my face, and tried to blend into the shadows. When I finally reached her house, the sun was just beginning to rise, casting a pale pink light over the quiet neighborhood. I stood on the sidewalk for a long time, staring at the front door and trying to summon the courage to knock. What if she turned me away? What if she called the police? I didn't know if I could handle another rejection. But then I thought about the poem she had read in class, the one that had given me hope. Still, like air, I'll rise. I took a deep breath and walked up to the door, my heart pounding in my chest. Mrs. Thompson answered after the second knock, her eyes widening in surprise when she saw me. "Nyla," she said, her voice filled with concern. "What are you doing here? Are you okay?" I shook my head, tears welling up in my eyes. I couldn't stay there anymore, I said, my voice breaking. I had to leave. She didn't ask any questions, just pulled me into a tight hug and led me inside. Her house was warm and cozy, filled with books and plants and the faint smell of lavender. She sat me down on the couch and wrapped a blanket around my shoulders, then disappeared into the kitchen to make tea. When she came back, she sat down beside me and handed me a steaming mug. "Tell me everything," she said, her voice gentle but firm. And so I did. I told her about the engagement, the abuse, the foster care, and my escape. I told her how I felt like I was drowning, like I didn't know who I was or where I belonged. And she listened, her expression never wavering, her eyes never leaving mine. When I was finished, she reached out and took my hand, her grip firm and reassuring. "Nyla," she said, her voice steady and strong. "You are so much stronger than you think. What you've been through, it's unimaginable. But you're still here. You're still fighting. And that's what matters." Her words stayed with me, like a lifeline I could hold on to when the world felt too heavy. She let me stay with her for a few days, giving me a safe place to rest and regroup. She helped me contact a lawyer, who agreed to take on my case pro bono, and she connected me with a local women's shelter that could provide me with the resources I needed to start over. But even with her help, the road ahead was long and difficult. I had to navigate the legal system, fighting to have my marriage annulled, and to ensure that my parents couldn't force me back into that life. I had to rebuild my life from scratch, finding a job, a place to live, and a way to support myself. And I had to confront the trauma of my past, learning to heal and to trust again. It wasn't easy, and there were times when I felt like giving up. But I kept going, because I knew that I had to. I had to fight for myself, and for all the other girls who were trapped in the same situation. And in the end, I won. Nyla's law was passed, and the age of marriage in New York was raised to 18. It was a small victory, but it was a start. And I knew that as long as I kept fighting, I could make a difference. This part of the story, delving into Nyla's life on the run and her fight for justice. The narrative continues to feel real and immersive, drawing the reader into Nyla's world and her experiences. The final part will explore her journey to healing and her efforts to advocate for others. Rising from the ashes, the courtroom was silent, the air thick with tension as the judge read out the verdict. I sat in the front row, my hands clenched tightly in my lap, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure everyone could hear it. My lawyer, a fierce woman named Sarah who had become my lifeline over the past year, sat beside me, her expression calm but determined. Across the room, my parents sat with their lawyer, their faces unreadable. I couldn't bring myself to look at them, not after everything that had happened. In the matter of Nyla's petition for annulment, the judge began, her voice steady and authoritative. "The court finds in favor of the petitioner. The marriage is hereby declared null and void." The words hit me like a tidal wave, washing over me and leaving me breathless. It was over. After years of fighting, of running, of surviving, it was finally over. I felt a surge of emotions, relief, joy, disbelief, but also a deep, aching sadness. I had won, but at what cost? My relationship with my parents was shattered, my childhood stolen, and my sense of self still fragile and uncertain. Sarah squeezed my hand, her eyes filled with pride. "You did it, Nyla," she whispered. "You're free." I nodded, tears streaming down my face. I was free, but I knew that the road to healing would be long and difficult. The scars of my past would always be a part of me, but I was determined not to let them define me. I had fought too hard, come too far, to let my pain hold me back. In the weeks and months that followed, I threw myself into rebuilding my life. With Sarah's help, I found a small apartment and a part-time job at a local bookstore. The light beyond the storm. Years have passed since that day on the steps of the Capitol, and my life has taken paths I never could have imagined. The little girl who once sat in a room full of giggling women, unaware of the weight of the world being placed on her shoulders, is now a woman who carries that weight not as a burden, but as a torch to light the way for others. I sit here now, in a small cafe in a bustling city, my laptop open in front of me. The screen glows with the draft of my memoir, a project I've been working on for years. It's not just my story. It's the story of countless girls who have been silenced, their voices stolen before they even had a chance to speak. Writing it has been painful, like reopening wounds that have only just begun to heal. But it has also been cathartic, a way to reclaim the narrative that was once written for me. The cafe is alive with the hum of conversation, the clinking of cups, and the occasional burst of laughter. It's a sound I've come to love, a reminder of the life I've built for myself. Across from me sits a young woman named Amina. She's 17, with wide, curious eyes, and a nervous energy that reminds me so much of myself at her age. She's one of the girls I've been mentoring through a nonprofit I founded, an organization dedicated to helping survivors of child marriage rebuild their lives. I don't know if I can do it, Amina says, her voice trembling. She's talking about testifying in front of a state legislature, sharing her story to push for stronger laws against child marriage. What if they don't listen? What if it doesn't change anything? I reach across the table and take her hand, just as Mrs. Thompson once did for me. Amina, I say, my voice steady and sure, your voice matters. Even if it feels like no one is listening, even if it feels like the world is too big and too loud, your story has power. And when you share it, you're not just speaking for yourself, you're speaking for every girl who can't. She nods, tears glistening in her eyes, and I see a flicker of determination in her expression. It's a look I know well, one I've seen in the mirror countless times. It's the look of someone who has been broken but is learning to rise. Later that evening, I stand on a stage in a packed auditorium, the spotlight warm on my face. The crowd is a sea of faces, some familiar, some not, but all here for the same reason. To listen, to learn, to fight. I take a deep breath and begin to speak. When I was 8 years old, I say, my voice carrying through the room, I was engaged to a man I didn't know, in a marriage I didn't understand. For years, I carried the weight of that decision, a decision that was made for me but that shaped every part of my life. But today, I stand here not as a victim, but as a survivor. Not as a girl who was silenced, but as a woman who has found her voice. I tell them my story, the same story I've told 100 times before. But each time I tell it, it feels new, like I'm shedding another layer of shame, another layer of fear. And when I finish, the room erupts in applause, a sound that fills me with both gratitude and resolve. After the event, a woman approaches me. She's older, with kind eyes and a hesitant smile. Thank you, she says, her voice thick with emotion. My daughter, she's 14. She was almost forced into a marriage last year. But because of people like you, because of the laws you've helped change, she's safe. She's free. I feel tears prick at the corners of my eyes as I take her hand. Thank you for telling me that, I say. It's stories like yours that remind me why I do this, why I keep fighting. As I leave the auditorium, the night air cool against my skin, I feel a sense of peace I haven't felt in a long time. The road ahead is still long, and there will always be more battles to fight, more voices to uplift. But for the first time, I feel like I'm not just surviving. I'm thriving. I've turned my pain into purpose, my scars into strength. I look up at the sky, the stars twinkling like tiny beacons of hope, And I realized that this is what freedom feels like. Not the absence of pain, but the presence of possibility. Not the end of the storm, but the light that comes after it. And as I walk into the night, I know that I will keep walking, keep fighting, keep rising. Not just for myself, but for every girl who deserves to see the light beyond the storm. This unique ending ties Nyla's journey full circle, showing how she has transformed her pain into purpose and become a beacon of hope for others. It emphasizes the ongoing nature of her fight while celebrating the progress she's made, leaving the reader with a sense of hope and inspiration. The story ends not with finality, but with the promise of continued resilience and change. This concludes the story. Thank you for watching until the end. I hope you found it enjoyable. If you did, please consider liking the video and sharing it with your friends. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and activate the notification bell for more captivating stories. Have a great day.